for another episode of the Cozy Corner of Cinema, episode number 173, being recorded on Wednesday, July 23rd, 2025 at 6:45 p.m. I have the warm coffee, so to speak. It's not exactly hot, but it's not cool. It's just a notch above warm, if that makes sense. I don't know really what you'd call that, but the coffee is definitely needed. Boy, oh boy, I am tired, but here I am, ready to talk about these damn movies for you guys. I appreciate you guys listening, man. You know, when I don't really look at the views too often on Spotify or on YouTube, but it's cool. It's cool when I see like, hey, a couple people checked it out, even if they only listened to a little bit of it. You know, that's totally cool, man. You know, time is so precious and life is so precious that you don't want to just, kind of casually just, throw it away on nothing. So for anyone giving the show a chance, or Peephole Pictures been listening to that at all, I appreciate that a lot. So thank you to everyone tuning in. That's real kind of cool of you, man. Oh man. Man, a lot of documentaries lately. A lot of documentaries that have been watched lately. Different kinds of documentaries too, but all kind of focusing around, the same kind of ideas and the same kind of time period. So I'll explain that more when I get along to it. But I want to talk about some here that I've been checking out. Tubi is such an interesting place. It's such an interesting streaming platform because the range of quality is sort of all over the place on there, where as opposed to something like Netflix or Amazon or HBO Max, where it's all sort of you're not going to be getting like Joe Schmo, his college thesis on there, man. It's a bit more curated, I should say. Whereas Tubi, you'll just find just bizarre, just odds and ends. I mean, just like films that you watch, and you're just like, what am I doing here, man? For better or for worse, there's just some things on Tubi where, I'm talking about, in documentaries in this case, it's sort of like when you're coming across documentaries on Tubi, you'll get a lot of really professional, really solid ones that are well made, but then you get is always the chance you're gonna get some pretty low level stuff. I guess as long as the content's good, that's what matters the most. But man, I remember watching this documentary on there a little while ago. And oh my gosh, I mean, the dude was making it basically mostly a slideshow, I guess, which isn't too bad as long as the information is good. But I was cracking up because this dude who was making it, man, he like would fumble his narration, but then he didn't cut it out. He just left it in. So you hear him talking, a sentence, so and so did this, blah, blah, blah. And he'd messing up, and he'd pause and go, and then so and so did this, and I'm just like, what is going on here, man? So I don't think there's any real kind of quality control on there. So it's great to really kind of come across some really exceptional documentaries as well. And the one I want to talk about first up today is from 2007, focusing on cult filmmaker Don Dohler, and it's Blood, Boobs, and Beast. And Don Dohler is a big kind of cult filmmaker. He's a renowned horror filmmaker in the way that very low budget, very independent productions, films. He's done films like Blood Massacre and Night Beast and Fiend. And his whole story is just so fascinating. I think, Don Dohler is just such a fascinating guy, and how he got into filmmaking as well. He was 30 at that point, and he was actually, he was, I think there was like a robbery going on, or there was something where, this guy, held a shotgun to his face, and his life kind of flashed before his eyes, and was like, man, I've been really hankering to make this feature, and I want to do it. So right there, man, it's sort of like a lot of people, they might wait for that sort of, unconsciously sort of wait for a big kind of event to really kind of put things into perspective, for them to kind of follow their dreams and do what it is they want to do. But from there, he makes these movies, and it's a history of him making these movies. They're very local, very low budget. Don Dohler is a very quiet, reserved guy. He makes very gruesome, he makes like science fiction, horror films and stuff. And it's interesting kind of seeing the trajectory of his career because, for a while, it's sort of like, yeah, these are cult films, but, they're not paying the bills. When you think of like kind of cult film directors, man, maybe you think of like John Waters or something, who, the guys who, make these outsider, or like David Lynch, these outsider kind of filmmakers who are really making these yeah, unique, kind of eccentric, one-of-a-kind films. And, David Lynch and John Waters, they end up crossing over into the mainstream and getting this sort of widespread acclaim, even with having those kinds of films on their back. Whereas someone like Don Dohler never kind of reached that. So when you have these kind of conventions, these horror kind of conventions where they kind of are really into filmmakers like this, that's a cult kind of status in its own right. But the film really deals with not just his life, but also the production of what would be his last film. Don Dohler would pass away in 2006, and his last film, Dead Hunt, would come out in 2007. This was co-directed by one of his partners as well, Joe Ripple, and it's interesting in the documentary they kind of talk about their different sort of perspectives on filmmaking and different kinds of films they want to make. But it's a film that really kind of shows the reality of independent filmmaking, especially through this period of time, or I should say through any kind of period of time, because Don Dohler is somebody who for a while had this real kind of drive to do it. He really wanted to make these films, but at a certain point it's sort of like, he gets very honest later on in his life. He's talking about, I want to be with my family. I got to take care of, his sister is mentally challenged, so he's got to take care of her. And he's got to really kind of, he doesn't want to do this forever. And it's sort of like we're seeing him during the production of Dead Hunt and, all the things that are going wrong, and enough for somebody like this to be like, man, I just don't want to do this anymore. Just simple things, just renting out the warehouse to film in, and then just something going wrong or no matter how minor or major. And we really kind of see the strain on Don Dohler, where he's just like, man, I had a drive for this once, but I really don't think that I can keep on doing this anymore. This is really going to be kind of it for me, because they show that, this dude ain't quitting his day job, man. It's sort of like if you're doing this, any kind of creative endeavor, you got to have some sort of real kind of financial sort of backing to fund whatever art it is that you want to do. I know ideally a lot of people will say like, go for it, completely put your all into it. And if that's your prerogative, then go for it. Don't let me or anybody else deter you. But ultimately, these films aren't paying the bills, man. It's sort of like, they talk about in this film, this dude's like, well, I can only be here for a couple hours because I got to go to work, man. And, they're filming on weekends and stuff when most of the people are available. Not everyone's reliable. They get an actor who doesn't even show up and, says he'll come back, but he doesn't. And it's just the trials and tribulations of dealing with production of this. And not everyone gets to sort of attain the status of, hey, you make these independent films, and then you get a whole kind of notoriety, or or maybe they get the call from Hollywood, hey, come make this film for us, this and that. When I think of like independent film, I don't think of A24 or Neon. To me, these are still studio films, man. Just because they're not Warner Brothers or Paramount does not mean that these are not still studio Hollywood movies, man. Because they are. They're just, more times than not, just really good films. To me, independent, I guess the scale is so... it's so subjective, so you could think I'm completely wrong, and that's fine. But like, to me, like, this is independent filmmaking, and this is like, putting money on the line and having to get this, having to deal with the financing, having to, you don't have a studio. There is no studio. It's independent. It's you putting this product out, you putting out the film or the music or the book or the painting that you want to put out. There's no committee kind of talking about, what to do and not to do. That's what, I always think about, like Orson Welles, it's sort of like this double-edged sword where, he has this early success, he's 24, directs Citizen Kane, and it changes the landscape of film forever. But then you look into the next kind of like decade or so of his life, and just the frustrations that he had with the studio system, and the troubles that he had, the time frame between Citizen Kane and Touch of Evil, in 1958, and then even after that, a lot of the trouble that was going through, and he was having to stay with, like, Peter Bogdanovich later on. It's sort of like, when you're aligning yourself to any kind of committee or anyone that kind of wants you to do something that you don't want to do for the sake of, not even art at that point, but financial reasons, it's sort of like, how independent are we really talking about, man? It's sort of like I hear, so many contemporary films being like, oh, this is like an independent, this is an indie darling, this is this and that. And I'm like, well, you got like Hollywood stars in this, man. You've got like $5, $6, $7 million budgets, man. Like, if you want to consider that independent, that's fine. That's your prerogative. You're not wrong. I just don't to me, that I think of independent like this. I think of the dudes who are having to work the 9 to 5 jobs, who are going out there on the weekends. You know, dudes like Peter Jackson who makes like Bad Taste. You know, Jim Van Beber makes Deadbeat at Dawn, and sometimes it pays off, sometimes it doesn't, but ultimately it's sort of like it's the heart and going after it. And it's sort of like, you know, having recently just rewatched American Movie, which is maybe the most famous film about making films, and it's sort of like with that film, the trials and tribulations that go through with that. But to me, this is even like, you know, this is such a great companion piece to that, of somebody who, you know, in that film, when you have Mark Borchardt, who is, you know, who is making this short film, and ultimately after the fact, I mean, he would kind of be most synonymous with that short film, with COVID, man. So let me get a sip of this coffee here. So on the flip side of that, it's interesting somebody like Don Dohler, who has made these films, man, who has made, you know, these kind of cult films, you know, Night Beast and Fiend and Galaxy Invader. But still, you know, it's just the troubles that come with it. And it's ultimately like, if you're not willing to kind of put your heart into something and, you know, put your all into something, then you really got to take a step back and think to yourself whether or not it's actually worth going for or not. I mean, if you want to be a writer, you know, are you writing? If you want to be a musician, are you playing and are you practicing an instrument? Or you want to be a singer? Are you practicing how to sing or anything like this and that, man? It's ultimately like, you have to decide that for yourself. And I think this film is very inspirational in that regard, of not just filmmaking, even though this film is primarily about filmmaking, and, you know, the hardships that come with it. And there is no big kind of money bag or light at the end of it all. Sometimes it really is just like, you know, you can only do it up to a certain point. But I think at the same time, it's somebody who has had a vision for the kinds of art that he wanted to make. He wanted to make Night Beast and Fiend and stuff. And he talked about in the film, you know, these films would get, you know, kind of made fun of online, like the whole, like, oh, so bad it's good, which I talked about before. I don't really, you know, I don't really like that so bad it's good thing. I've always been a big proponent of, you know, if you're enjoying it, then that's good, man. You know, you can revel in the ineptitudes of it, but ultimately I've seen so many films that I find so dull and I just can't wait for them to end. But then I see so many films that are quote unquote so bad it's good, where I just have such a fun time with them, and you show them to people, and it, you know, it's like Sullivan's Travels. You have that kind of communal cinematic experience where it really kind of puts things in a perspective of just like, yeah, I don't know, it's definitely not, I don't think so bad it's good. It's because we're all having fun with it, and there are great, you know, important films that I don't think of as much as maybe some films like Samurai Cop or you know, Things is like one of my favorite films, because I just have so much fun watching them. I'm not making fun of them, and they're just so strange and out there. I'm just like, wow, okay, cool. I you know, I like this stuff. But yeah, I was just really taken aback by this film, how down to earth Don Dohler seems. You know, and when I'm talking about people online kind of dogging on this film, you know, he's even like, yeah, I don't really care if people are dogging on them or not. You know, if they're having fun watching them, then so what? I don't really care. I'm making these films, you know, because I want to make them, and that's the best kind of stance you can take. It's sort of like, you know, not, you know, being like, oh, you know, I don't make fun of my films, because when you're putting yourself out there, man, whatever it is, a film, a book, a painting, whatever, you know, there's gonna be dudes out there who are just ready to rip it apart, no matter what it is, man. I'm sure, you know, it doesn't matter if you're making Citizen Kane or, you know, you're making, you know, some $2, you know, backyard thing. People are going to be ready to just rip it apart and nitpick it apart. And if that's going to turn you off, then you really got to kind of put in perspective what you want to do this for, you know? If it's going to turn you off from making, you know, your own art. Because ultimately, every film out there, every book out there, every band out there has somebody who hates it. And I don't hate anything, man. I don't hate any film. I don't hate any book. I don't hate any band. You know, I mean, there's films I don't like. There's bands I don't like. But I'm not like, I hate that, man. If somebody is like, if somebody came to me and this film I thought was like awful, terrible, and someone's like, oh, you know, I want to watch that. Should I check it out? I'll always say, yeah, check it out. You're gonna get something out of it that I don't, maybe. You know, if they ask my opinion, I'll be honest. I'll be like, yeah, I didn't like it. You know, I don't think it's a good film. But should you watch it? Yeah, go for it. Of course, absolutely. I'm never gonna turn somebody off to a film if they're interested, and I'm never gonna say, oh, avoid this film, because there's plenty of poor films that I see. I just don't talk about them on the show. I don't see the point, you know. Doesn't mean I'm gonna like hide and, you know, and be like, oh, I don't want to criticize any film. But the way that I see it, I mean, this is the cozy corner of cinema. I want to turn you guys on to good cinema and films that maybe aren't on your radar, or maybe films that are, that maybe, you know, I talk about and you kind of are like, oh, okay, you know, I want to rewatch that, or I disagree with you, you know, but it's sort of like, I like what you're saying. And that's what I was saying before, is that, you know, it's sort of like, I just like hearing what other people have to say about films. You know, I just don't want to break it down to like, oh, this film sucks, whatever. It's just there's just no time for that. But yeah, I mean, this is just a really, really good documentary. I think on repeated viewings, this is going to become one of my. I think this is already just like one of the strongest kind of documentaries about filmmaking that you can watch, because it's so down to earth, it's so sincere, and even at one point, his brother is telling a story. About their mother, and man, it made me emotional, man. I got teary eyed. I was like, wow, that really kind of puts into perspective everything, that these guys are going through, and with their sisters, mentally challenged, and all that. It's just a really, really touching story. I love this documentary, man. I really can't recommend it enough for anybody who is, is an artist, or even if you're not, even if you're like, man, I don't want to, make a film. I don't want to write anything. I don't want to, whatever. That's fine. Hey, man. It's just a good story. I think it's a really good story, and it's given me a new appreciation. I should say, I'm sorry, not a new appreciation. It gives me a strong appreciation for Don Dohler. I've never seen any of his films. He passed away in 2006, but his films have since been re-released on Blu-ray. I mean, Vinegar Syndrome put out Night Beast, and I forgot who put out Fiend, but either way, these films will be watched, especially with that kind of context. So, yeah, man, and even if you're, it's one of these films where I think, yeah, if you've seen American Movie a whole bunch of times, and also I want to mention that there's two guys who are cracking me up in this. They interviewed two Don Dohler fans, and every time they cut back to them, they're wearing like a different hat, like a different mask or something. And then they're kind of like laughing at the movie a little bit, but these guys just love these films because they're quoting the films, they remember them, they're having like their own kind of drinking games, and man, I mean, this is just like a total cozy kind of documentary. And at the end, it's not a clear, everything wraps up ending. There's not the big, hey, you sold a whole bunch of copies and now you get this and that. It's a very honest ending, and it's very much, unfortunately, what kind of happens with a lot of these things with being an independent filmmaker like this. The risks that you have to take, and the risks, more times than not, maybe won't pay off, but it's ultimately up to you whether or not you want to kind of take that risk. But I love this film, man. I think it's just absolutely terrific. Just one of my favorite things I've watched this year, and just a must watch, especially for anybody, let alone if you're a fan of Don Dohler, then of course watch this. But even on Letterboxd, I was looking, it's not even like a lot of people that have logged this, man, which is a real shame, but it's easy to find, man, so check it out, man. It's real cool stuff. And speaking of other documentaries, I guess I'll briefly talk about a bit more lighthearted, talk about from 2020, talk about Skin, a history of nude cinema in films. I'm sorry, of nudity in the movies. And you're like, Dan, you're talking about this documentary. What is there to talk about? And there's quite a bit to talk about. So it was made in 2020. It goes from the pre-Hays Code era, early on with the short, oh man, what's it called? I'm blanking on the one. It's the lady who takes her clothes off and goes to get washed. I'm blanking on the name of it. All the way up to contemporary when this film came out. So they talk about sort of the evolution of in the Hays Code, they really want to tone down the sexuality, and then of course when you get into the 60s, and it's basically it's a free for all at that point. The Hays Code is basically bulldozed by these young independent filmmakers who are making these, really going out there, and they're just not only just about the nudity in the films. I mean, that's just a symptom of kind of the free-spirited filmmaking, let alone the free-spiritedness of the 1960s. But it's sort of like their own kind of stamp, where it's like they're bearing it all, literally and figuratively. It's just like, these are the films we want to make, and these are films for adults. These are the films that if you watch a film and you have a couple and they just had sex, but then you get to the morning after and they're covering themselves up with the sheets, and from a narrative perspective, it's like, well, they just had sex with each other completely naked. Why would they be embarrassed to be doing this right now? So it's more than that. They bring up tons and tons and tons of films in this. They talk about the evolution into the 80s and into the 90s. They interview tons of filmmakers. They interview, a lot of the actresses and the actors that are in a lot of these films too, which is really great, and sort of their different kind of perspectives on this. It's a very fair and balanced documentary as well. They interview a lot of actresses, a lot of filmmakers. Just going through some of them here, you have like Joe Dante, Martha Coolidge, Peter Bogdanovich, Linda Blair, Bruce Davison, You have Diane Franklin, you have Shannon Elizabeth, Pam Grier, just Camille Keaton, Tracy Lords. Malcolm McDowell has the funniest line in the whole film when they ask him what the plot of Caligula is, and I won't give that away. I wrote that as my little blurb in my Letterboxd kind of review, but it made me laugh out loud in terms of him talking about Caligula and the botched production on that, botched to them, because he tells a great story about watching the film and something that he reacts to when they're filming that he thought was going to be in the film, and then what they actually have him react to is hilarious, man. I'm a fan of Caligula, man. It's one of these just kind of wild, sort of crazy films I've talked about before on the show. But it's great hearing Malcolm McDowell be so open and talking about it, and how upset he was that, what the film had turned into from Tito Brass, of just, these grand, sort of incredible sets, and then you're basically just making an adult film with these big stars sort of, in the background and stuff, this and that, to sort of be like, hey, we got Peter O'Toole, and we got Helen Mirren and Malcolm McDowell, and also here's explicit unsimulated sex, But it's like I said before, it's very fair and balanced, because they kind of talk about the different eras. Some of the actresses talking about that to them, and to them then and now, they don't really see it as a big deal. They're just like, okay, well, this is just the character, this and that. You sure you're maybe a little nervous going forward. And then they talk to some other actresses who were like, yeah, they really kind of like wanted me to do this, and I was feeling unsure, and I don't know if I would have done it now. And they interview like John Cameron Mitchell in the film, who makes a good point. He talks about John Cameron Mitchell, of course, did Hedwig and the Angry Inch and Short Bus. Short Bus especially is a film too, which they surprisingly enough didn't mention in the film, like I thought they would have, in terms of a film with unsimulated sex. But I guess it's more about nudity than it is the unsimulated sex. But anyways, to talk to him, and he made a great point about kind of the shifting sort of societal ideologies to nudity in films, where he talks about in the 80s there's more maybe conservative sort of religious people that were upset at nudity in the films, and thought it was going against morals and stuff. And then he talks about now, where it's probably more like left-leaning kind of liberal people who feel that the actors are being taken advantage of or something. So it's interesting. He talks about kind of the shifting of everybody thinks they're unbiased, and everybody thinks that they wouldn't be on the side to sort of be like, oh well, I think everybody should do whatever they want, and then they have their own biases that kind of come into the play. And they go up to like modern day, at least to the point that 2020. So they talk a little bit about like the 50 Shades of Grey movie, the first one. I don't remember when the second and the third one came up. They talk about that, and like the nudity in that, and sort of the sexuality on a mainstream level. It's a little sporadic, I will say. They do take kind of big leaps with the timeline in a way where it feels linear, so to speak. But then there is a point where it doesn't feel like. When you get to the 70s into the 80s, I feel like at that point is when it starts to wane a bit more. So I guess, let me rephrase that, 80s into the 90s. Because in the 90s it talks about the erotic thriller and all that. But it was interesting enough that they don't really talk about, sort of now, at least in contemporary mainstream films, that nudity is really not very common anymore. They do talk about the disparage between, women getting naked on film and men getting naked, which is a fair point. I've always said that. It's sort of like, I'm an equal opportunist, man. Give something for everybody. And obviously when I say give something, I don't mean, hey, just have nudity for the sake of nudity, unless it's that kind of film. But more so, it's sort of like, yeah, I think if you're gonna have two characters who are like a couple, and you only have the lady naked after they had sex, it's sort of like, well, wait a minute, what about the dude? But actually, that's a film to film kind of basis. You got to sort of judge it on the context of the script more so than any kind of a generalization. But yeah, it goes into the contemporary sort of films like that, and it talks a little bit about like I guess the newest one they probably end up talking about, As Blue as the Warmest Color from 18. When did that film come out? And they talk about, that's like very brief. They talk more about the nudity and that, and the explicit kind of sex in that film. It's a controversial film because of, of myriad things, from the kind of the onset sort of conditions and these long, explicit sex scenes in the film. And it's a solid film. I think it's a good film, but it's one that, I think that film is excessive in myriad ways, not just with the explicit sex, but I think the runtime, certain portions of the film that I think overstay their welcome. I think it's a really well acted and well written film, but I think that's one that could have benefited possibly from a re-edit. But either way, that's another conversation. But yeah, it's one where you wouldn't think of how strong of a subject it could be, because you're just thinking like, Joe Schmo's like, history and nudity and movies, whatever, this and that. But it does chronicle along and gives good perspective to the filmmakers and how they, and how they feel when they're filming it, and the actresses and the actors how they feel when they're filming it. And they interview guys as well in the film. They interview the heavier set guy from Borat. I don't know his name, but he's actually one of the best interviewees in the film. He kind of talks about, he's not the kind of guy you would expect to get, nude in a film, and sort of like how he really, that whole thing was really kind of planned out, and sort of by taking it to such an exaggerated comedic way, where if you guys have seen that film, you have those two characters and they're completely naked, but they're fighting, they're just like smashing glass, and like, there's a lot of suggestive positions, and it's a funny scene. Obviously Borat's a very popular film. I don't think I need to explain, kind of the context of that, but yeah, good interviews overall, man. This is another one I really liked a lot. This is one that I was just like, again, on Tubi. I'm like, all right, I was kind of surprised at how much I like this. It is I think it's about 2 hours, but honestly, it doesn't really feel like that. It actually goes by a pretty brisk pace. Actually, I should say it's 2.5 hours, 2 hours 10 minutes, which is interesting. And they actually, they interview Kevin Smith as well. And Kevin Smith is a guy who, like, it's interesting because he's a guy who I'm really not a fan of his films. I think Clerks is a masterpiece, but other than that, he's the only filmmaker where he has like one film that I am head over heels in love with, and he's never made anything else that I'm like, that I really care for. But I think he's such a charismatic and likable guy, and I loved hearing him talk about the controversial release of Zack and Mary Make a Porno, and kind of the ridiculousness of the MPAA at that point. And they actually interview one of the MPAA people, which is great to kind of hear her perspective on it. Also, it's a really fair and balanced documentary on a subject that you may not even have thought twice about. Was a little bummed that there was no mention of the Emmanuel films because of how popular those were, and the first kind of adult sort of film to be distributed by a major studio. But you can't cover everything. But either way, man, yeah, it's just another good documentary that I would check out. And then I guess I'll briefly talk about, because I have a little bit of time left, in terms of segueing from that into one more documentary, which is Magic Trip, Ken Kesey Search for a Kool Place. And this is another one that is kind of going off the 60s sort of era of that free love, that kind of free, this is like 64, when you have these guys who are on a cross-country road trip in this big kind of old bus. They paint it, and and they're going across the country. They're filming everything, but for decades the footage was not seen. Well, it was seen, but it wasn't constructed together. I don't know how available the footage actually was, but then it got turned into a documentary in 2011, and throughout they have Stanley Tucci narrating, and a lot of the participants have since passed, or were passed away before the release of the documentary. So there's a lot of, they'll have it where it's like Stanley Tucci asking a question, then to my knowledge they cut to like archival recordings of them answering the question. But it's an interesting kind of trek across America at that time. These hippies sort of taking copious amounts of LSD and just going across the country, and in the middle of this kind of societal sort of change between the Civil Rights Act and and Martin Luther King and JFK, and the shifting of the tides. Everybody talks about sort of the shifting of the tides from into the new wave of American Hollywood, and you're getting just these incredibly unique and singular films, and of course where that went to later on, and eventually kind of like dying out in the 1980s. But these people just being at that time, and it's one where it's more about being in the time and the place, because it's, I think if you're looking for a big kind of story to this, it's really not that. It's more about being with these people, these eccentric kind of characters in the setting, and a lot of them, as they go on, sort of either start, being disinterested in this kind of lifestyle, or are trying to hang on to it even afterwards. And it's solid stuff, man. It reminded me of Lost in America with Albert Brooks, which is just a really terrific comedy from the 80s. The next one that I think the less known about it, the better. That's how I watched it. We have Albert Brooks and his wife. I'm blanking on the actress name, I apologize, but they want to quit their jobs and be like Jack Kerouac, on the road. And Jack Kerouac is actually a big part of the Magic Trip documentary and his dissatisfaction with the whole kind of hippie movement. But anyways, I am completely running out of time. I have so much more to talk about and no time to do it. But this coffee is definitely cold right now. But you guys take care. I appreciate you listening, and just whatever art that you want to do, man, just pursue it 110%, because this is the only go around that we get. So you really want to take total advantage of it and live the best life you want to live, man. So hey, you guys take care and God bless. All right.